Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the PwC Webcast, Navigating PeopleSoft's Journal Processing, Complexity, and Risks. Before we get started, we want to take care of a few house cleaning items. The first is a brief but very important disclaimer that I will read to you. Certain matters reviewed today may represent services that PwC may be prohibited from providing our audit clients. In those instances, the information is being provided to inform you of options that you may want to consider as you evaluate the solutions described in today's webcast. Due to the complexity of independence rules, any potential services for our audit clients should be discussed in advance within the context of the independence rules. The information contained in this document is provided as is, for general guidance on matters of interest only. PricewaterhouseCoopers is not herein engaged in rendering legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice or services. Before making any decisions or taking any action, you should consult a competent professional advisor. Now let's cover some administrative matters. For a better viewing experience, please close all other applications. For a better sound quality, consider using headphones. To enlarge the slides, click the bottom right corner of the slide window and drag to the desired size, or click the green Maximize button on the top right side of the side window. To download today's presentation, click on the Resources widget at the bottom of the screen. Submit questions at any time during the session using the QA window on the left side of your screen. We have a lot of material today. We're hoping to be able to get to questions, but if we don't, rest assured we will reach out to you via email and provide you the answers. If you experience any technical difficulties during the polling sessions, reply to the questions in the QA window and include the poll number. Now let's cover CPE credits. In order to receive a CPE credit for the program, you will need to be on for the entire 60-minute program. You'll need to respond to all polling questions. At the conclusion of the webcast, please click the CPE widget at the bottom of your screen, then follow the subsequent prompts to download your certificate. CPEs cannot be awarded for participants not logged onto the webcast as themselves, phone-only participants, or participants who view the on-demand version. All right. Let's get started. My name's Steve Sullivan. I'm a principal out of the Boston office. We have with us Jake Dyniewski, a director out of our Houston office, and Erik Nolte, a director out of Washington Metro. We belong to the National Enterprise Systems Risk and Controls practice. So what that means is that all we do day in and day out is deliver services related to Oracle's various ERPs. So ERPs include PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, EBS, CCMB, to name a few, working as part of larger transformational projects, designing security, assessing our clients' controls, and helping implement various compliance software. I've been working in the industry for over 20 years, and I'm one of the leaders on the Oracle Enterprise Systems team. Jake's been with PwC for over 10 years with a focus on PeopleSoft and Oracle EBS. Jake has primaries in energy, utility, and healthcare, but he also supports additional industry in his role as our national PeopleSoft leader. Erik is a director with over 9 years of experience with PeopleSoft and JD Edwards. In addition to delivering PwC solutions for our clients, he leads the development of PwC's tools used in the assessment of PeopleSoft. So let's cover the agenda. The objective of the session today is to help you understand the various loopholes that exist within PeopleSoft that could potentially harm your journal processing efforts. Jake and Erik are going to set the scene with an overview of risks related to journals, and then we'll be honing in a number of core technical configurations that are critical within PeopleSoft. And we'll be sharing the implications of those configurations not being set optimally. We'll start, as I mentioned, with PeopleSoft, general understanding of PeopleSoft journal risk, and then we'll hone in, focus on key risks associated with user preferences, journal spreadsheet import, journal generator, or JG, batch processing, and the journal approval workflow. In addition, we'll be covering audit logging, a new feature within PeopleSoft. So let's start with the first polling question. To what extent do you feel your journal controls could be overridden today? A, greatly. B, somewhat. C, none. D, not sure. Please submit your answers now.
And Steve, thank you for that welcome. For those of you on the phone who are keeping tabs of voices with names, this is Jake Dyniewski. Steve, I like this question, as kind of a precursor for our discussion today. A couple things that come to mind when we think of ERPs, and sometimes we feel as though, or we think that all of these types of risks are kind of embedded as part of the ERP package. We've paid a lot of money for these solutions, and so sometimes we feel like some of these journal entry type of risks are actually already addressed. So I like this question as kind of a setting the stage for today's discussion. There are a lot of areas where we're going to cover today that provide opportunity for perhaps oddities to exist within your journal entry processing process, journal entry area. So we want to make sure that we set the stage and just get a context for maybe what the audience feels in this capacity.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll just give it one more second here. I think we're having a technical difficulty with pushing the results or seeing the results. Give us one moment, please. Excellent. So it looks as if the number one answer is not sure, followed by somewhat. Appreciate everyone's participation with the polling question. Now I'm going to hand it over to Jake, who will cover PeopleSoft journal risks. And
thanks, Steve. So when we think about journal risks, there are a handful of topics, as Steve has alluded to in the agenda, that we want to cover off on today. We're going to look at these on this next slide in sort of a pinwheel type format, but we hope by the end of this session that you'll understand some of the key risks related to these journal entry areas. There are several we're going to cover. Hopefully some of these topics on the left resound with you as an audience member. There are scenarios where perhaps there are journal entries that we might assume could be systematic in nature that may present themselves as actually a manual journal, or maybe present themselves as a system journal when in actuality we've been able to tweak some of the attributes associated with those and make them actually become a manual journal entry. Some of these may resound for functionality and features that you're actually using today, whether that's batch processing or spreadsheet journal import processes that as we'll speak through when we go through the respective material today, perhaps we call out some things that you can take back and look at your own processes and see whether or not there are areas that you perhaps could use to go and shore up. So these are some of the topics we want to cover off on today. On the next slide here, we're going to draw a little bit of context for you around when we speak through this process, what does that really look like, and overlay some of these topics and the risks that are associated to these topics so that you can start to see and draw some correlation when you think through journal processing flow for your respective organizations. So at the top left, we have commonly what we see subsystem journals that are originating from a subsystem, such as an AP or an AR or an assets type of ledger. Those get funneled through the journal generator, as Steve alluded to, and Erik will articulate more on in a few minutes. We have an opportunity to perhaps edit some of those journals. Maybe we review and approve those journals systematically or maybe in an external function outside of our system. There also are avenues for uploading of journals through manual processes that are embedded as part of the ERP, through batches or Excel that we'll speak about here in a moment. But we want to draw just some correlation for you between the topics which are on the top right in the legend and the normal course flow that we understand to exist within most of our ERPs today. ultimately resulting at the end of the day with approved journals that are then posted to our ledger and impact our organizations. What we want to speak through a little bit briefly is around what we mean when we articulate system journals versus manual journals. System journals are those that are automatically going to determine, the system's automatically going to determine our debit and our credit amounts. The system will also determine the GL accounts based on system configurations. And many of you who are part of the installations of some of your systems will know that there are accounting entry templates that help to drive ultimately where these entries are booked. The users are typically going to enter subledger transactions within those respective subledger modules, and that's going to then flow through, get handled through the journal generator process, and ultimately get booked in the corresponding GL account structure. So that's what we mean when we say system. When we're talking about manual journals, it's really the flip of that, but we want to just speak very quickly to this. The user is going to determine the debit and credit amount and the corresponding GL account. And as we mentioned, there are a couple paths that we'll speak through for an actual manual journal entry to be input into the system. These journals, it's key to understand, these journals are not systematically linked to any other transaction specific to the ERP application. So again, just want to draw some correlation here for you when we think about what a system journal really is and a manual journal. Because as we walk through today's content, there are some scenarios where a journal that appears to be systematic in nature could present as a manual journal, and in fact is a manual journal. And we want to be mindful of those nuances so that we can close those loopholes or lock down our system accordingly. So just for context for those of you on the call today, this is a screen that we're going to use kind of in format for the duration of the session today. At the top you'll see the navigation path or what we commonly call the breadcrumb of where you would navigate within your ERP to actually identify the screen or the page that you're going to use. So this is the common manual journal entry page that's used within PeopleSoft that likely resounds with you if you've actually entered in journal entries or if you've maybe assessed functionalities and features related to manual journal entries. So I want to briefly touch on some of the key risks that are going to be the content that we walk through for the duration of the session today. So user preferences is the first topic, and user preferences is an area where there's an overlay and there's a combination between the actual navigation that a user can achieve through their deployed security, as well as these user preferences that provide either a confirmation of the functionality or sometimes even stand independent of the navigation path and provide additional capabilities within the ERP. Secondarily, we're going to speak through the journal spreadsheet import process and a couple of oddities that may exist within your environment around how a user could actually go about entering these spreadsheets or uploading these spreadsheets to enact journal transactions within your GL. And we want to speak through perhaps areas that you may want to consider on how you've provisioned out this access or this capability. The last two that we have here are some of the areas that get a little bit more complicated, and we really want to spend a little time on them. So journal generator, as we noted earlier in kind of our process flow, it's an area where there's opportunity for manipulation potentially or kind of fingers to be into the middle of your journal entries that are arising from your subledgers. And we want to be careful and mindful of who has access and how they're actually involved in touching and editing any of these journals that we might otherwise feel or perceive to be systematic in nature. Finally, we're going to speak through our journal approval workflow process. So this functionality may not be deployed at all of the organizations that we have on the phone today, but we want to understand it because there are a couple of ways in which this can actually be bypassed through some of the batch processing capabilities and checks and balances that we have turned on within the system. So it's going to be our final topic of the day, but a critical one as we think through some of the features that we have today or perhaps features that we look to deploy tomorrow. So with that brief overview, we want to go into our next polling question, and I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it. All right, for CP polling question number 2. How often are users and their user preferences checked to determine appropriate access? A, at least once a year. B, every couple of years or so. C, never. And D, not sure. Please answer now.
That's a great question, Steve, because as Jake's going to go into a little bit more detail here in a minute, user preferences are really quite pervasive. So the ones that we're going to touch on today are select few from the GL pertaining to the general ledger activities, but they actually, within PeopleSoft financials, are really involved in a lot of the sub-ledger activities. So it'd be interesting to see how often people actually look at these.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Well, let's see what the results are. All right, so we've got nearly 60% at least once a year, and the second answer, most popular answer, is D, not sure. Great. Thank you for participating. All right, let's move along to GL user preferences. Jake.
Sure, thanks. That's actually reassuring that folks are at least looking at these once a year, because as Eric mentioned, these are pervasive, not just only within the GL, but also more broadly within your enterprise for the modules deployed. So we do want to speak through a couple of these and reiterate the importance as well as some of the features and functionalities that the user preferences provide specific to the GL area. So again, for your context and information, we've got again the breadcrumb of where these user preferences would be deployed or be turned on or off, toggled on or off within your enterprise, within your system. And commonly we see these actually handled either within a IT support function, perhaps in a back office IT security administrative group. Hopefully that's where you would have this function sitting, but we do want to highlight that we're not going to cover off on all of these. We've highlighted a few here on the screen that we are going to speak through that we've determined to be at least relevant for today's dialogue in the context of journal entry processing. But there are a lot more, and as Eric said, the pervasive nature of user preferences is something that we want to be mindful of, again, within the GL as well as more broadly, because it does provide access that perhaps we're not even aware of at times. So let's speak through a few of these and draw some correlation to practical use and perhaps risks that may exist if we're not mindful of how these are deployed and awareness. As the poll asked, how often do we review and how often do we assess? It's good that we're doing it at least once a year, and maybe it merits more frequently depending on how often people are shifting functions within our organizations. So let's speak about these a bit more succinctly as we walk through them. So the first one that we've got is changing date on correction journals. So this is a user preference that actually allows a user to change the date when we're actioning or executing a correction journal. So the risk here is potentially that someone could misallocate balances between periods. So if we think about this in a practical sense, if someone's going to go in and do a correcting journal or an adjusting journal or reverse a journal and change perhaps something around a GL distribution in that space, what they can do if they've got this user preference is actually change the date on that journal to where maybe we're tweaking a distribution, but we're actually also now going to make it an out-of-period adjustment, which maybe is merited in some unique circumstances, but maybe we don't want to have happen as often, or maybe we want to be very mindful around what users can actually use this functionality. So this user preference is one that again, the theme for user preferences is we want to be understanding who has the access, how often this is being provisioned, and certainly locking down to the extent we can, or restricting this down to really a need-based type of provisioning. So the second one we want to speak through briefly is changing journals from within the journal generator process. And Eric is going to speak a bit more on this process holistically here in a few minutes. What this user preference actually provides or allows is for a user to update the chart field and amounts while a journal is sitting within that journal generator process prior to it formally being posted within our GL. So those of you who think about this process, that's immediately a little bit concerning perhaps if someone can tweak or manipulate a journal that's coming through the subsystem, and we might interpret or assume that it's a systematic journal, if someone with this user preference can go in and tweak and modify, that now tweaks and changes that representation, within the GL, because they might be able to change the chart field or change the amount. Secondarily, and equally as concerning, is this now starts to create an issue within the GL and the reconciliation back to the subledger. So there may be additional effort and overhead associated with tracking down maybe what happened, or investigating why do we now have discrepancies either in accounting distribution or perhaps even in the amount that's represented within the GL. So again, want to be mindful of who's got this, perhaps how often and when it's actually being used, and understand that it's right fit to the individuals who need this access. So as we move through to this third one, I want to speak briefly to control account concepts. So control accounts, in the general terms, are those accounts that we've chosen and determined to be really restricted down to only systematic type of journals that we don't expect to have to modify. So we lock down certain accounts so that we have a higher level of comfort being achieved over what's ultimately hitting those GL account structures, and that there's not ability to manipulate those, because it's really intended for only systematic journals that are going to automatically be pushed up into our GL. So what this user preference actually provides is the capability for a user to modify those journals that have hit those control accounts. They can copy, they can delete, they can even unpost these journals, which again is contrary to perhaps what we would understand about what we would anticipate happening with control accounts. But again, can be concerning and could even cause, again, discrepancies between subledger and GL when we start thinking through, final end of period close. So our final one we want to speak through is around the mark journals to post, and this is a little bit of a naming convention misnomer here, but we want to speak through kind of what it actually provides. So this user preference enables a user to set a journal's actual approval status to approved for posting. So when we think through how the system actually functions, journals when entered will be in a pending stage and need to be verified and validated and actually achieve an approved stage prior to then being picked up and actually being allowed to post within the GL. That approval process can occur a couple of ways, and Erik will speak on some of the approval workflow processes later. But what this user preference actually provides is a jump perhaps over those workflow processes to allow a journal to then achieve that approved status and have the opportunity to either let the batch process then pick up those journals and post them automatically, or there's even a further opportunity for users to manually use the posting process and push those journals that are approved now into the GL. So again, a concerning capability, particularly as Erik will articulate later, around the possibility of bypassing controls that exist in our environment that we would hope are part of our kind of journal entry transaction processing evolution here. So just a couple of these user preferences that we want to speak through and provide a little bit of context around what the features and capabilities are, and maybe make you aware of what some of the features and capabilities are. We want to be mindful of who has achieved these user preferences. Are those right sized to the individuals that need access, and how often are we assessing those to ensure that they are right sized and right fit to our organization. So as we move on to the next topic around journal spreadsheet imports, want to speak briefly around some of the loopholes here. Many of you are probably familiar with this functionality and may use it pretty frequently when you're doing bulk imports or bulk uploads of journals where you don't want to manually enter them. So functionality that's probably used at a lot of the organizations that we have represented here today. So very quickly, what is this? It's a capability through delivered functionality to use either Excel or flat files to actually upload journals. A couple things to mention that we'll speak again a little bit on here momentarily around the risks. What's actually needed to do this import process? There's two things that are really required. The first is access to some of the web libraries that are a technical aspect of security that needs to be provisioned so that someone can go and access the actual import processes. And the second side is really nothing more sophisticated than the actual journal entry upload template that can be readily found through Oracle support, or also that comes with our installations when we go live with these applications. So want to again draw a little bit of context for you around what this looks like and what we're speaking through. So many of you are probably familiar with these tools and with these screens that we've got in front of you right now. But we do want to call to mention one specific area, and that's around this field that's able to be tweaked and modified around the user ID. So when we think about journal spreadsheet imports, sometimes those are coming from external systems that we've downloaded an extract of the transactional activity, and we're now going to upload. So from how that may represent in the end of the day is it looks as though, or we want it to be represented as though it's a third-party application, bulk import, and looks like a systematic type of entry. What we have here, though, is a bit of a loophole where someone could actually modify and override the user ID that's associated to these journals. We want to speak through that just briefly around the two key risks that as we've talked through this process, that present themselves or may present themselves at our organizations. So two key risks. As we just spoke to, the fact that you can actually modify or tweak that user ID that's associated with these journals starts to become a bit concerning from the standpoint that we might assume some of these imports are again, third-party, systematic-based journals, and we may be able to tweak that to show as such if we're even just uploading journals ourselves. So it starts to create a bit of a data integrity concern when we start to think about downstream processes around when we do some systematic analysis or we do some ACL analysis of journal entries and maybe targeting specific individuals or targeting specific circumstances for transactional anomalies. This starts to create a loophole in our environment where maybe we're not as robustly capturing that population of journals that we might want to. The second side that we articulated around how does someone achieve specifically this journal spreadsheet import process. Sometimes what we find at organizations is that when provisioning security, there are certain elements of security that might be bulk assigned. And the web libraries themselves are an area that sometimes we see are bulk assigned. Sometimes our inclination, as organizations is to not want to restrict individuals in terms of the capabilities and features that they might need to actually execute their day in, day out functions. So sometimes what happens is let's just give everyone, as much as we think they might need, when in actuality we might be provisioning them some capabilities that we might not want them to actually have the features and functionalities that are associated here. So just a couple risks to be thoughtful and mindful of as we think about a feature and a functionality that we might have deployed at a lot of our organizations today. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Erik to talk about the journal generator process and speak through kind of the risks and areas of focus here.
Thanks, Jake. So when we think about a journal generator, to take a step back here and explain what that really means. Journal generator in PeopleSoft is really the means by which PeopleSoft uses to get your day-to-day business process and accounting transactions from the subledgers or from your subsystems rolled up into the general ledger. So it's essentially a batch process and a set of configurations that drive that process. A couple of key points as to what it actually does along the way here is that it tags in a couple of different ways the source or the origin of that entry. There's two different sources that we'll refer to in the presentation here. One is the system source, which is not readily visible to the user. It's configured as part of this journal generator process to identify which subsystem source the journal entry came from. And there's also a journal source, which we'll get to in a few minutes and is more visible to the user as part of this process. The reason that's important is commonly these are mechanisms that we use to try to identify automated or manual entries, and there's some caveats that go with those along the way. So when we think about it from a visual perspective, if you look at the screen now, we've got our subsystems or subledgers over on the left. Those roll up into accounting entry tables, which are basically the repositories for these subsystem entries. The journal generator process is configured to go to a specific accounting entry table for a specific subsystem and process and generate journal entries based on templates that are also configured. After that is completed, there's still a journal edit process that needs to complete in PeopleSoft, as well as the journal post process. The journal edit process, it is a process and a little bit of a confusing misnomer there. What that is actually doing is it's essentially an edit check or a validation step that confirms that journal is valid before it can be created to post. So an important thing to note with this visual is really, even though we've got system-generated entries, there is a time gap, as it were, potential time gap between the journal generator process and posting to the GL because PeopleSoft is a batch-based system. There are also a couple of limitations with these journal-generated entries. So for these subsystem entries, the user ID is actually populated from the journal generator run control, meaning if the user ID running journal generator is stamped on those entries in the GL, which can be beneficial from a tracking perspective, which Jake just alluded to. But unfortunately, PeopleSoft does not natively, in those transaction details, capture last modified by user ID. It only identifies the journal creator, which can pose some problems if you have some of these other risk elements in place that might allow a user to modify what appears to be a subsystem journal entry. So when we think about where the specific risk areas are that open us up to this type of manipulation for journal generator entries, the first one noted here is really from the change journal from journal generator user preference, which Jake referred to earlier in the presentation. So having that user preference combined with access to your standard journal entry page, a user actually has the ability to modify the accounts and values for an entry that was generated from the journal generator process but has not yet posted. So posted entries within PeopleSoft cannot be modified, but valid entries that have not yet posted do open themselves up to some potential modification. There's also some batch process screens that provide some similar functionality to users. The one mentioned here is the Edit Journals process page, which I'll show you in a minute, which is basically a mechanism to allow a user to push the subsystem entries in batch through that journal generator edit checks and posting process. The page, however, does not inherently take user preferences into account. So what does this look like? The Generate Journals Request page, so JGen or Journal Generator, is a fairly straightforward run control page. There's options on there as to whether or not you want to run the journal edit process and the journal post process. You select the business unit that you're gathering the entries for, the templates and accounting definitions, and you can run the journal generator manually from here. This can also be set up as part of a batch process, and as I mentioned before, the ID that runs this will actually be stamped on those subsequent entries. When it comes to posting in PeopleSoft, if you have workflow enabled, PeopleSoft is going to assuming that entry should go through a workflow process, PeopleSoft will hold off on posting until all of those approvals occur. As Jake mentioned, the mark to post user preference is an area that allows a user to essentially mark that journal as approved to post. So that can be done through the journal entry and the user preference combination that we mentioned. There's also this Edit Journals page which is a run control that actually has a mark journals to post flag on it as well. This delivered from PeopleSoft does not take account into that user preference. However, did want to note here that there is some delivered people code hidden behind the scene that's commented out, and there's instructions provided from Oracle on how to implement that if that's something that you want to use in your organization but still want to have some of those control mechanisms over that. So that uncommented code, what it essentially does is checks that user preference for the user who's running this page, and it will hide that option or disable that option from the user. So that's another mechanism within the journal generator process where the user may have the ability to not only edit through the entry screen, but in batch actually process through and post entries from the subsystems as opposed to allowing them to kind of flow naturally through potentially your workflow process, which we'll get to in a minute. When we talk about batch processing in PeopleSoft, there's a couple of different distinctions to make here. So there's, as part of the journal entry screen, you have the ability to run the post process. You can queue up the post process. And the run control behind that is noted in the top bullet section here, the GLPP post and the GLJP, I believe is what it's called in 9.2. Only selecting valid journals from this status or journals that have been essentially approved to post are going to post when captured here. And then there's also the journal generator post process that we mentioned previously. So there's a couple of different ways or mechanisms to work with that post process. What we see a lot of organizations try to do is strike a balance between that automated batch process and restrictions there and allowing users some manual mechanisms, especially around the area of period close, to be able to push those journals through to post in order to make specific deadlines and such. The risks with that, however, the previously noted journal edit page, there's also a run control that's marked journals for posting, and really neither of which takes into account neither of these batch pages actually takes into account user preferences by default. So merely having access to these batch processes opens up a potential risk in your batch process to bypass that any workflow controls that you might have in place. What we're going to get to after the workflow section is some audit logging that can be considered to help alleviate some of this if this is something that you find that you need in your organization or struggle without in your organization. But we don't have a perfect solution for you to silver bullet, as it were. And with that, I will turn it back over to Steve for the next polling question.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. Polling question number 3. Are you going through an upgrade or reimplementation in the next 12 to 18 months that may allow some of these configurations to be designed effectively in your system prior to go live? A, yes. B, no. C, not sure. Please answer now.
And Steve, this is Jake again. I like this question for a couple of reasons. I think it draws to light for us that oftentimes, these types of activities are used to reevaluate our environments as part of a big transition or transformation type of activity. We often see that those are opportunistic times to reevaluate some of these areas, maybe our security deployment, maybe how do our controls mitigate some of these risks, how are our processes designed that we don't have some of these loopholes that exist. But I do want to give us pause just for a moment to think through, even outside of these windows that are opportunistic, are we looking at our environment to think through some of these risks and areas that perhaps we need to take a more proactive approach on ensuring we've got the right checks and balances in place. So I'm interested to see, certainly the outcome of this polling question, because it's a good indicator of maybe opportunistic times to review some of this, but also want to point out, we don't want to wait until these windows exist to address some of these areas.
I think that's a really good point. So let's see how we did. Okay. 20, I believe that's 28% say yes, but the majority is at 40%. 30% do not know. So good insight. All right. So why don't we continue, and I'll hand it back off to Erik to cover journal approval workflows.
Thanks, Steve. So when we talk about approval methods, journal approval methods specifically in PeopleSoft, a couple distinctions here. There's a mechanism in place to pre-approve journals, and that's certainly an option and may be a valid option. We'll touch on that briefly, but the main focus here is actually more on the approval workflow functionality that's delivered with PeopleSoft. There's two different types. You might hear the term virtual approver or the AWE. And that's the newer, the AWE, the approval framework from PeopleSoft, most recently introduced with PeopleSoft 9.1. That's going to be the focus of the next few slides here. You can accomplish a lot of the same things with the virtual approver. However, it requires a bit more involvement from IT. There's people code that runs it, whereas most of the approval framework, while it still does require development and IT involvement, a lot of it is accessible through the front end and through configurations, which obviously has its benefits but also poses some of its own risks. So we'll talk through that here. From an approval option perspective, we've got a few different options to start out with in setting up the approval workflow. We've got pre-approved, you can require approval, and you can default to a higher level. The journal entry process is a delivered workflow process, and you can work with these different levels or those different approval options at these different levels, which are the business unit, which is the highest level, the ledger, and the journal source. The reason that the levels are important is really you have, because of that default to higher level, so you have the option to set specific configurations at the journal source level, for example, but then for specific journal sources, you could default to the higher level up to the ledger or even up to the business unit. So it can be fairly concise and straightforward, or very quickly get pretty robust and complex depending on your need. So journal source, just an overview and a recap on what that means. This really determines how a journal should be processed in this workflow process. It configures the processing options as it relates to workflow, or can be a key consideration from a workflow process. I've certainly seen clients heavily leverage the journal source in their workflow design. Because this is actually, if you'll recall, readily visible to the user during the online entry screen, journal source is actually one of the fields that the user can populate from a selection. Because of that, the user kind of has the option to potentially dictate where in the workflow this entry may go, even though it might not actually represent the true source, or more what we would call the system source of that entry. So as a result of that, we have seen some clients do customizations such that they either limit the access to that entirely, or limit which specific journal sources can be accessed by given users, and there are certain complexities associated with that we won't get into here, but it is something that we have seen a few clients do. When we talk about configuring the journal source, the first screen here is really just what that configuration looks like. What you're looking at right now is the basic setup for the ONL, which is typically your online journal entry journal source. So this is the one that most organizations will use for their manual entry. So when I'm going to the journal entry page and I'm manually creating a journal entry, this is more than likely the journal source that you would want an individual to use. The next screen here shows the approval options for that same journal source, and you can see the journal approval options set there, pre-approved, require approval, or default to higher level. So depending on my selection here, I'm basically dictating how I want transactions that originate with this journal source, the online journal source, to behave as it relates to my workflow. There's a lot of additional configuration that needs to go into then how you route that workflow, what those dollar amounts are, but this is the initial kind of setup option that you can structure around that. The next level, depending on, again, what you decide to do at that source level, you can take it up a level and go look at the ledger level, ledgers for a business unit. So the example here shows from our sandbox data, business unit US001, ledger group adjustments, selecting either pre-approved or default to a higher level or requiring approval. So we have the flexibility to break that apart at each layer, and then finally up to the business unit. Now at this highest level, as it were, because this is where the roll-up stops, default to a higher level is no longer an option. But you do have the option to say, if a journal, given its source, given its ledger, has defaulted up to this level for this business unit, do you still want to require approval, or do you want to consider it pre-approved? And that's kind of how you logically think through some of these things. So some important audit considerations when you're talking about configuring your workflow. So in addition to making sure that you've got the subsequent steps and paths and all of that configuration, which we don't have time to get into today, the absence of a workflow will basically do the same thing as automatically approving. So that mark journals for posting activity basically is what occurs if workflow is not enabled or if a journal does not fall into one of those approval buckets. So you need to think through how you use your sources, how you use your ledgers, and for what business units in order to properly kind of catch and route any of your journal entries to even get them into that workflow process if that's something that you want to do. But then also keeping in mind these run control pages, mark journals for posting, the mark journals to post user preference, as well as the edit journals run control page are all ways in which you could potentially bypass all of your kind of hard work on the workflow front. And so with that, we'll get here into a little bit of audit logging. So up until now, we've got some very specific risks within your journal entry process. The user preferences, which are fairly, well, at least on the face of it, straightforward because they're check boxes that can be changed relatively easily. Looking then at the journal spreadsheet import, and we've got some difficulties with that just because of how it's been designed. And what we wanted to do is touch on how can we get some additional transparency or coverage over some of these things that might be occurring. So there's a lot of different ways within PeopleSoft to accomplish audit logging. There's the delivered PS audit functionality, which has been around for a very long time, and that's audit logging at the table and record level, which can be kind of cumbersome. What we're going to focus on here today, as opposed to that or database logging, is more the financial audit framework, which is, again, a relatively new release with PeopleSoft, and it allows for application-level auditing. So what that means is that activities that are performed through the application will be logged accordingly. Now, it is limited to some select business processes to start, and Oracle started to release additional sub-processes, but one of the first that was available is actually around the general ledger process. So what you see on the screen right here is actually the audit logging ability. The record, which is the actual table, is shown at the top, and the specific transactions that are shown or available there. What you can see is that this is very much at a high level, at a transaction level. So as opposed to having to think through, what table, what field do I need to go to log, as you might have in the past, all you really need to think about are what are the specific business activities that I really want to capture. So whether it's creation of a journal, editing a journal date change, the mark to post, those specific activities are actually all called out and predefined. Now, I will say that this assumes that you have a standard delivered, PeopleSoft journal process that, if you have customizations in that space, there may be an impact on how well this can capture that information. So that's something to absolutely take into consideration. But one of the things to note is that the journal spreadsheet import that Jake mentioned earlier and the ability to modify that user ID during the spreadsheet journal upload, that financial audit framework will actually capture the user ID who performed that activity, not the user ID that is populated in that form. So it is a mechanism to get some additional comfort and transparency in that area in particular. As always, whenever turning on any of these new configurations in your system, you want to make sure that you're properly testing them, not in production, and make sure that you understand what is and isn't working, and make sure that you get the right folks involved in evaluating those before implementing them in your production environment. And with that, I will pass it back over to Steve for the next polling question.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Next polling question number 4. Who within your organization would be responsible for testing the configurations we've discussed today? Would it A, be internal audit, B, management or IT, C, I'm unsure? Please submit your answers now. Let's give it a little bit more time.
So this is an interesting question, because I think what I typically see at my clients is actually all over the map. By and large, I would say internal audit does a lot of the testing, but I do have some clients that kind of diverge away from that. So looks like we've got a little bit more disparity in the responses than I would actually expect to see, which is interesting.
So let's push the results. Interesting. Okay, so we've the B is the largest answer, management or IT, followed by internal audit, and then there was 23% not sure. Very good. Thanks for your participation. So let's recap. What have we covered today? What have we learned? Well, I think we've learned about the various sources for journals, subsystem journals, Excel uploaded journals, manual journals. We've gained an appreciation for the processes associated with entering, approving, and posting journals. We've highlighted some of the major journal processing risks with a specific emphasis on key setups surrounding user preferences, journal spreadsheet import, JG or journal generator, batch processing, and the journal approval workflow. We've also gained an understanding of the automated audit capabilities associated with the new financial audit framework. And I think one of the main takeaways that we hope you get today is that major ERP systems like PeopleSoft have been designed to accommodate the needs of numerous industries. The intent, obviously, is to create flexibility for how transactions are processed, making it more appealing to a larger base of users. This is often accomplished by providing many configuration options. And as we can see based on today's presentation, configuration options obviously create complexity that may inadvertently introduce risk, or I like to refer to as vulnerabilities within your ERP system. So I hope what we've learned today is that if we're not vigilant about understanding these configuration options, properly managing access to the ERP system, In monitoring these configurations on a periodic basis, we're exposing our organizations to potential risks that could lead to costly, time-consuming remediation and even financial misstatement. So with that said, I think we have time for a few questions. I think we'll be able to get in one or two questions. So the first question I'd like to ask is, are people who say every couple of years or so not public companies? I think that's in reference to preference checks. Jake, why don't you give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, I don't know, specific to the respondents, who obviously, provided what input on the level of review that's occurring. But I will say this from kind of our perspective as an independent party who assesses a lot of organizations. It's a bit of a fluid answer, but when we think about the complexity of user preference and how they are overlaid onto the normal security model, I think we would hope that as frequently as you're assessing your security, which may be dictated by the level of transition and movement within organization of personnel or changes to the security structure, we'd hope that you more frequently assess both your user preferences as well as your security that's enabled with your environment. More stable organizations may look to a less frequent type of assessment, but we really would hope that at least once a year, you want to reassess and reevaluate, but predicated on the level of stability of your security environment is often going to dictate and merit, perhaps more frequent review.
Excellent. I want to take one additional question. Question is, and we'll send this to Erik, are there any tools in PeopleSoft that look for segregation of duty issues in terms of users' access to certain transactions?
So the short answer to that question is there are not tools in PeopleSoft delivered that look for segregation of duties issues. There are tools on the market that do focus on that from a number of vendors, but they are either kind of bolt-on utilities that interact with PeopleSoft or in some cases are additional tools that you can implement in your PeopleSoft environment that are written in People code, but natively PeopleSoft is not delivered with a segregation of duties evaluation tool. The other part of that was around some specific transactions. Again, there's utilities on the market and that offer some capability to look into what types of transaction activities folks are performing based on specific criteria that you set up, and that's certainly something that we help clients with frequently, but not natively within PeopleSoft.
Thanks, Erik. I appreciate that. All right, so we're coming up on the hour. We did not get to all questions, and I apologize for that. There's quite a few. We will be responding via email subsequent to the webcast. Appreciate everyone asking the questions that they have. And we also hope that everyone's enjoyed our webcast today, Navigating PeopleSoft Journal Processing, Complexity, and Risk. We hope you found it enlightening. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope to see everyone back at our next webinar, which will be announced shortly. Thanks for joining.
And just a note as well, Steve, that individuals should download the CPE certificate using the widget at the bottom of the screen.
Perfect. Thanks, Erik. Thanks, everyone.